One of our issues, though, is I don't think our communities are ready for having households full of seniors, couples, living in the neighborhood. We've never had that model. We've always talked about, the women will move into rental apartments. And so we have to develop in our land use planning. What it was about 6 years ago, you had that huge snow where the streets didn't get, some of the side streets didn't get the snow removed from the sidewalks for 2 or 3 weeks. What about the seniors living in behind that who can't shovel their sidewalk? So there's a whole range. Talk to your fire departments, your police departments about the emergency calls they get. They aren't about fire issues or police issues. They're about worry, care, et cetera issues. So some other issues here. Okay, so now let's get to what we're interested in, and specifically into the issue of housing. So the life cycle of housing. And we can see as people age from 15 to 24, 25 to 34, by the time they hit 35 to 44, they become what's called maintainers of households. Maintainer of a household is the person that the household says supports it, primarily supports it financially. You can see that strong life cycle pattern where by the time we hit 35, 44, over half of the people are maintaining their households, and the remainder of the people are living in those households. So there's the pattern. So this, if you like, describes to us how our housing market responds to our population. So this is saying here's a pattern of housing in terms of meeting the demands of the population. Let's go back to 30 years to 1976 and take a look at what happened. And in all of these age groups, over the age 35 to 44 up to 75 plus, the probability of somebody having their own household has not changed. Calgary's housing market works really, really well to meet population demand, in the sense of people aspiring to have their own home. They're achieving it, they're attaining it, but there are some distinctions. In the 75 plus, the maintainer rate has gone up. It's gone up because people aren't institutionalized, so they can actually maintain their own homes. It's dropped in the 65 to 74 because instead of women living on their own, they're living in couples. But where we see a significant change is the 15 to 24 and the 25 to 34, a significant drop in the number of the percentage of people who are able to maintain their own homes because they're living in their parents' home. But they're not living in their parents' home because they can't afford to go and rent a place, because exactly the same pattern prevails in Moose Jaw, in Corner Brook, in Come By Chance. They're living at home because we told them to go out and get an education, and they're doing so. So housing market, there's no constraint in Calgary saying people are forced to live in groupings other than what they choose to, unless it's always created that problem. So you're not having people doubling up because of a housing market failure. They may be doubling up because they want to buy a new Nintendo or an iPad or have 5 cars or go skiing or take vacations. But the housing market works here. There's no argument that can be made that the housing market isn't working in Calgary. Okay, so I've taken that then probability of a maintainer and plotted it out just by itself. And notice because it increases with age, what does that tell you given that Calgary's population, the major growth in Calgary's population is in the older age groups? It tells you that the demand for housing in Calgary is going to go faster than your population. So if we're talking about a doubling of the population, you're going to see housing demand increase even faster. So good news for the Calgary housing market, because you've got growth down here in the starter market, and you've got significant growth up here in the tail end of the market. So number one, good news overall for the Calgary housing market. Let's split that and take a look at how people occupy themselves in housing. And again, we see relatively good news because high propensity of people in the 45 and older age group to be owners compared to the percentage being tenants. So there's the distribution, and it's what we would historically anticipate, which is you're likely to be a tenant in the younger age group, or owner-occupier in the older age group, with some increase in the last age group. Now, as this is not trended, this is a snapshot, and that tenant thing is getting squeezed in the older age group as they own. So there we are in ownership in 2006 from the census. And there's what we would call the first-time purchasers market. When I hear people say, gee, my kid's 22 years of age and can't afford to buy their own home, I kind of shrug. That's not what you should be doing when you're 22 years of age. You should be paying off your credit card. And maybe moving out of my basement. So the issue there is the next slide was going to show you that in every age group, the propensity of people to be owners went up. So there's the first-time purchaser, 25 to 34. So that's what we want to characterize. We want the entry level of the market, we're going to focus there. We're not going to focus on the younger population. So when somebody says, my kids can't afford to buy, tell them to grow up would be a good variable in terms of the kids should just wait a while and get their education. So there's the pattern. There's what owner occupancy was in 1976. Everybody tells me that nobody can afford to buy their homes anymore, and in every age group there has been a significant increase in the percentage of people who owned. Maybe we're not looking at the data. Maybe we're saying people who shouldn't own or haven't saved up enough money or don't have high enough incomes can't purchase. But Calgary's real estate market works really well not only in building housing, but building ownership markets, housing. So the percentage of seniors who were owners in 1976 was 30%. It's 45%. 65 to 74, it's 39% rather than, now it's 48%. 49, now 41. Significant increase. In 1976, 3% of the 15 to 24-year-olds could own. Now it's 4%. Young people have a higher probability of being owners now than they were in 1976. So in terms of housing affordability, you've got a great market. You may not be meeting expectations, but John Travolta's not coming over later tonight either. Okay? The issue is the market is meeting market demand and it's doing it well. So there's in terms of ownership. If we take a look at rental, what's happened is ownership is up, and the growth in ownership has been entirely at the expense of rental. Because for most people, not all people, but for most people, ownership is what you aspire to. Partly you aspire to it because you think it's a great investment, but in reality, very few people buy a house for that reason. They buy a house for security of tenure, they buy a house for certainty, they buy a house so that they can have the ability to change their living arrangements, to make their own decisions. And by the way, it's not a bad idea if it's a good investment as well. So home ownership has grown. The reason young people are not out in the housing market is not that they can't afford to buy, it's that they're not tenants. Why aren't they tenants? Because they're in school, living in their place. You could never rent a place as nice as Mom's B&B. So there's the pattern. Great housing market in Calgary. This is what's going to continue to happen. I don't see us having significant continued erosion in rental, because what rental we do have now is largely oriented to either people who cannot and should not make the hurdle. Subprime in the United States demonstrates what you do if you strongly induce people who cannot qualify for a mortgage to qualify for a mortgage. We don't want to go there. And transients, people who are here for a while and then they're going somewhere else, they need rental housing. Okay, so there's the pattern. Now let's talk about what we really care about, which is where price is going, or why price is going. You have to understand that housing prices, and men, you have this to look forward to as well as women, the discussion of housing prices is much like the discussion of menopause, which is to say that it's either too hot or too cold. Okay, so the instant we go from an overheated market, we go to it's going to crash. And the reason people say that is they simply don't look at the data. Bank economists in Eastern Canada continually put out reports that say you can't afford to buy a house in Calgary or Vancouver, et cetera, that it takes 80% of your income to buy a house, and of course if you take after-tax income, that says 100% of your income, and that means you can't afford to eat, dress, or go out, which means you have a lot of naked, cold people in Calgary who are well housed, and yet you'd really like to comment on that, except, damn it, people keep buying houses. I guess that they can't afford. The reason is when we take a look at what's happening to housing prices, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. It isn't a simple variable. There's a lot of things that influence housing prices. Okay, one question I have to put to you in terms of Calgary housing prices is why they are so low, not why they are so high. Because the potential demand in Calgary is above housing prices in Calgary. So here's the MLS picture from 68 to 2010 in Calgary. That run up in 6, 7, and then sort of plateauing after that. When we have a discussion of housing markets, we have to talk about who's in the housing market. It's really dumb to talk about a housing market, well, housing market, this, that, when nobody's in the housing market. CMHC publishes this data, purchasers of housing. People in the entry-level housing market, 25 to 34, account for, and take the younger age group, account for a third of the market. 2/3 of the market are people who are older, who have higher incomes, who've already owned a home. So if you want to understand the housing market, what you have to understand is not what's happening to the entry level, which is the smallest segment of your market. You have to understand what's happening to 2/3 of your market, which is the people over the age of 35. If we take a look at the purchasers in the Calgary market, instead of looking at their age, take a look at what they are. 70% of them are previous owners. When we look at the Royal Bank or the TD Bank's index of income to price, what's left out of that? Equity. What do 70% of the purchasers in Calgary have that's not income when they go to buy a house? Equity. They're drowning in cash. So that when we go in and say, gee, you know, CMHC is going to change from a 1% down to a 5% down to a 6% down, these people are saying, I've got to turn the page in the newspaper because I've got 25% down, 40% down, I got 100% down. So first of all, previous owners are 70% of your market. Previous owners, 2/3 of them are buying bigger houses. 75% of them are buying more expensive houses. So what you've got is the majority of your market is out there with lots of equity buying bigger houses. What do you think that does to housing prices? I think it pushes them up. I also think that changes in interest rates are pretty well irrelevant to these people. I mean, they want them low, but they've got equity. So the issue there is if you want to understand pricing in Calgary, you cannot talk simply about incomes. You guys see this. You know how many people come in and are buying and saying, well, I'm going to sell my previous house. 2/3 of your purchasers are selling a house to buy a house. They've got that equity. And given their age groups, which was primarily in the 35 to 54 age group, they've got the incomes as well. So to judge a housing market on the performance for entry-level market participants doesn't tell you anything about the market. It's a great headline, but it doesn't tell you anything about the market.